Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Today I wanted to get away from the Denny book and not get into the Lee book, but I really wanted to focus in on Donald Miller, who really piggybacks off of Denning's idea of the importance of narrative intelligence. Now with Donald Miller, his work is really in like the branding and marketing industry. And so he talks about the importance of storytelling when it comes to trying to find ways of gaining customers or followers or things along those lines. But I think a lot of what he talks about can be really pertinent when it comes to understanding your own story of your team, the own story of your company, and as well as, your job as a leader is to be successful, and that may mean bringing in more clients and customers and consumers. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, when it comes to telling a story, there's a couple things to think about, right? So essentially, if you think about almost any movie you've ever seen, it's basically a character has a problem, and then they meet a guide who gives them a plan and calls them to action. From there, that action is either going to end in either a success or a failure, but it's going to be dependent on the actual character. So Donald Miller uses this plot grid, and we're going to have a few examples here, but essentially a character goes down, has that problem, then meets a guide, and typically that guide is someone who's experienced that before. That person will then give them a plan, calls them to action, and then that action either results in success or in failure. So let's look at the Star Wars example, right? So Luke, the evil empire, is he a Jedi? Obi-Wan Kenobi, he's been there and understands, tells Luke he has what it takes to trust the Force, go defeat the Empire, and that action either results in destroying the Death Star or the rebellion getting crushed. We can also use the Hunger Games, right? So Katniss must survive and must stay good and authentic. So she meets Haymitch. He's won the Hunger Games before. So she has to endear herself to the public to get sponsors, and then she has to compete. And then from there, depending on what, the success or failure of that competition, either District 12 rejoices or she dies and District 12 is crushed. Now, let's get in. Now that we have an understanding of like the characters or of the plot line, let's get into like the specifics here. So in terms of the character, right, this is a person who's going to take a journey. Now, usually they're called to a task that is outside their comfort zone, but necessary for their survival and the benefit of others. And oftentimes, if you think about some of the more famous movies that you've seen, they're sometimes driven, the character, by that benefit of other people more than kind of their own survival. They're often not the strongest or the most reliable, but they are the one that must take action. The only character that must experience a character arc. No one else really changes. If you think about even some of the major movies that you've seen or even the stories that you've read, there might be some tangential characters who have a slight character arc, but no one will have a major character arc like that main character. And some of the examples are Moana, Frodo Baggins, and Rudy. Now that character has a problem, right? The problem posits a story question, right? So there's a number of questions that are going to be answered, but these are some of the major ones, right? Will the character get out of the problem? How bad will the damage be if they don't? Will they get the love interest? Will they win? And from there, we have to understand that there are three major types of problems. One, there's external problems, right? So for Moana, she must save her people. For Frodo, he must save Middle-earth. And for Rudy, he must make the Notre Dame football team. Then we have internal problems, right? So does Moana have the courage and skills? Will Frodo have the discipline? Does Rudy have what it takes given his chances? And lastly, we have philosophical problems. Will good win over evil? Will group interest win out over self-interest? And can noble character compete with brute strength? From here, they meet a guide. In almost any major story where they're following this arc, they're going to be met with a guide. In stories, characters do not solve the problems on their own. A good guide has been there before, and the first job of the guide is to listen, understand, and empathize with the hero's problem, right? And depending on where you're catching your team or you're catching your customers, oftentimes you're going to be the guide, right? What you are trying to do is make your team members or make your customers, they're the heroes of their own story, and you're simply saying like, hey, I've been in this situation before, and I want to guide you to success, right? And it doesn't mean that you're going to be taking that action for them, right? Because no one likes to be in a position where someone above them is kind of over managing them or hovering over them or taking these actions for them. They want to feel empowered to make these decisions and enact these actions on their own. That guide will then give them a plan, right? So oftentimes the hero is confused, not sure what they're doing or where to go. The job of the guide is to break the confusion and give them confidence. Sometimes it's just through pep talks. Oftentimes it's by letting them know that they've been there before. But the plan can be something as simple as a paradigm shift, right? It can be just something simple as like, you're thinking about this in the completely wrong way, right? Sometimes that's all it really takes for someone to make that shift. Then that guide calls them to action with that plan, right? A call to action is the point in which the hero must decide whether to act on the plan or not, right? Because that's essentially that the guide can only get you so far, right? Oftentimes, if you think about, I know I used to teach PR classes before, and sometimes you'd pitch something to clients and you give them a plan like, this is what we think is the best thing for your company. And sometimes they'll decide not to hire you because they just don't feel like that's the right plan of action for them. And the same thing's going to go with your team, right? Especially if you give them that liberty and that flexibility to say, look, if you're asking me for my advice, this is the way that I think you should go, and these are the actions I think you should take. It's still up to them, right? I mean, unless you are telling them this is what I want you to do, if you're really letting your team kind of guide themselves and take their own actions, your advice and your guidance is only going to go so far, because then you have to let them succeed or fail on their own. They must choose whether to stay in their comfort zone or embrace the plan given to them by their guide. This is really important, especially if you get thrown into a leadership position and you're starting brand new, right? Oftentimes when you're put in that position, it's because someone before you either just left, right? They maybe found a different job, or that person was fired because things weren't going the way that they were supposed to. So then you're getting brought in because of your expertise, but you're also responsible for getting people to buy in with you, right? And they have to make that decision if they're going to follow you as the guide and embrace the plan that you're giving them, or if they kind of want to keep doing what they're doing, and it's really on you to get them to buy in. That results in success. So obviously a happy ending would be the success. Sad ending would be a tragedy. And the audience must know what might happen if they are going to remain interested, right? So essentially, when you're letting your team know about some of these potential outcomes of either taking the plan or not taking the plan, it's good to go over some of the, not necessarily consequences, but some of the things that could potentially happen depending on the actions that they take. Same thing goes for clients and customers, right? You have to let them know, like, this is what we think we can offer you if you decide to go with us. Now, if you don't go with us, here are some things that potentially could happen, and we do not want that for you. So this is why we think our plan is the best plan for you and why you think you should go with us. Or it could lead to failure, right? So careful screenwriters and novelists help us imagine dire consequences, whether or not they usually happen, because this builds suspense. Now, when it comes to being in a leadership position, it's usually not a good idea to really focus in on the potential failures or the potential consequences of these failures. But it is a good idea to be realistic about some of the situations and some of the context that you're in. An audience must have a clear idea of possible failure. Now, a story must be clear, and I think in our progress through the Dennings book, I think that's been pretty clear for us, right? The importance of telling a good story, knowing a good story, embracing the story of your brand and of your company, and you yourself as a leader. Like, one of the practices, and if you haven't done this before, that I would do with my face-to-face classes is, as we sit around, I'd ask them, tell me a story about one of the greatest leaders in your life. Now, eventually someone would just say, well, this person has great character, they're very trustworthy. And I would have to stop them and say, that's not what I'm asking, right? Like, I don't want you to tell me their characteristics. I want you to tell me a story where just by telling me that story, I can tell what kind of leader they are. And you should be thinking about what story in your life really highlights exactly what kind of leader you are. And that's why I think this example from Donald Miller can be so beneficial for us. Focus on clarity first. First you learn form and then you improvise. And that should be really important, especially if you're a leader who is kind of put in the spotlight quite often and you're not used to storytelling. I think it would be good to get some of the nuts and bolts of these stories, and then you can start kind of doing your own thing once you get the nuts and bolts of it, right? Get the big beats of your story, and then you can start improvising. One of the other things we would do in class, is use that plot grid that I just showed up from Donald Miller and have someone say, okay, put yourself in the position as the guide. Tell us a story about someone that you encountered who needed your help and you guided them to a successful and or a failed plan. Either one, right? Like if you put it up to them, that's not on you. That's on what actions they took. And then similarly, I would ask my students to say, okay, now you're the character, you're the hero. What guide did you encounter that helped you get to where you were going? I know for me, one of the examples I use often when I'm doing that exercise is right about the time when I was finishing my PhD, there was a lot going on. Found out my niece had cancer. There was a lot. In addition to that, there were also some academic things going on where I almost didn't finish. Right at that point, if you talk to a lot of PhD students and people who've gotten their PhD, there are many times throughout that process where you're not sure if you want to continue going. And eventually, I met with the chair of my department and talked to her about what was going on. And she gave me a clear plan. She's like, look, if you want to finish, here's some things that you should do and here are some actions that you should take. It's totally up to you. If you decide in the end that this just isn't for you and you don't even want to teach anymore, then that's an option for you. But if you do want to finish, here's what I think you should do. And eventually it worked, right? I took her advice. I didn't take all of her advice, but I finished and I'm here now because of her guidance. Okay, and understanding and then creating the structure of the story is crucial. So if you're trying to build, I'll say this, I think every organization has a story, but the onus is on the leader to create an engaging story of that brand or of that company. And I think that's something you should be thinking about, not just about your own story as a leader, but your own story as a company to get your team to buy in, right? I think there's nothing better than knowing that you're part of an organization that you're really excited about. And lastly, framing your story, right? And I think this is really important. If you're really trying to think about how to build your own story, right? Going through that exercise, like I said, these are the questions that you should be answering, right? Who were you and what did you want? What was the problem you encountered and how did it make you feel? Who did you meet or what did you read that helped you? What plan did you come up with after meeting with the guide? What did it feel like to take action on that plan? What could have been lost if you'd failed? And what was the happy or tragic ending you experienced? If you have some time this week, I suggest you take a look at these questions and really try to think about those two options, right? One, where you're the hero and the character and which guide you met and how they helped you. But on the other side, this might be the best way of figuring out your hero story or your guide story, right? Like, who did you encounter? Or who encountered you and who did you guide to success or failure? So that would be my additional, not necessarily homework, but if you have some time, look over these questions and try to answer them so you can try to figure out your own hero story.